The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. It was a case that had drawn a lot of attention, not just for the billionaire sitting in the defendant's seat, but also for the judge overseeing it. The man at the center of the case, Harrison Drake, was a wealthy and influential figure. His name was known far and wide, not only because of his fortune, but also because of his reputation. Harrison had spent his life building an empire, one that spanned industries and continents. To him, the world was a place where rules bent to his will. People admired him, feared him, and most importantly, respected him. He was used to being the one in control, always in charge, and always above the ordinary struggles others had to face. Today, however, was different. He was in court for a corporate lawsuit involving his company's questionable business practices. While the case wasn't the most significant of his career, it was still important, and the billionaire knew he had to handle it with his usual confidence. But today, there was one thing Harrison hadn't anticipated: the presence of Judge Malika Owens. Judge Owens had earned a reputation for being stern but fair. She was a woman of principle, and her career had been defined by her unwavering commitment to justice. But there was something else that made her stand out: her strength and the way she carried herself. As a black woman, she had faced more than her fair share of challenges, both inside and outside the courtroom. Yet, through it all, she had risen above it, earning her position not just on merit, but by commanding respect through her character and decisions. When she walked into the courtroom, there was an undeniable shift in the air. The murmurs of the crowd softened, and the room fell into a hush as everyone turned to see her enter. She was no stranger to this kind of attention, but it didn't seem to affect her. Dressed in her judge's robe, with her posture straight and head held high, she walked in with the poise and authority of someone who had spent years earning the respect of her peers. But Harrison Drake, in his usual arrogance, had other plans. As the judge made her way to the bench, Harrison remained seated, his eyes focused on his papers. The courtroom, now aware of the slight, began to buzz with quiet whispers. It wasn't just an ordinary act of disrespect. In the world of courts, not standing for the judge was a deliberate challenge, a public defiance of authority. It wasn't about the rules or the case itself. It was about showing who was in charge, and Harrison made sure to show just that. As the rest of the people in the room exchanged glances, waiting for something to happen, Judge Owens remained calm. Her expression showed no signs of irritation or surprise. She had seen arrogance like this before. She had dealt with people who thought their money and influence made them untouchable, but she had never been one to back down. The atmosphere grew heavier as the seconds passed. It was clear that something would happen, something big. The energy in the room shifted from nervous whispers to expectant silence. All eyes were now on the judge, waiting to see how she would respond to this open display of disrespect. Would she let it slide, or would she take a stand? No one knew for sure, but one thing was certain. Everyone was waiting to see what Judge Malika Owens would do next. The courtroom was filled with an air of tension as Harrison Drake remained seated, stubbornly refusing to stand when Judge Malika Owens entered the room. The move was deliberate and calculated, a clear statement of disrespect aimed at the judge. Everyone in the room, from the lawyers to the people observing, knew exactly what was happening. There was no mistaking it. Harrison's arrogance was on full display. It was as if he thought the rules didn't apply to him. He had been in enough high-profile cases to know that some judges would overlook such behavior, especially when dealing with someone of his wealth and status. But this time, the situation was different. Judge Owens, however, did not let the billionaire's defiance affect her. Her eyes, calm and unwavering, locked onto Harrison, but her face betrayed nothing. She didn't flinch. She didn't even raise an eyebrow. Instead, she continued her movement to the bench, all while the courtroom held its breath, waiting to see how she would react. Her silence, though, spoke volumes. It was a clear message. She wasn't intimidated. She wasn't going to let one person's arrogance derail the proceedings. The murmurs around the room started to grow louder, with people glancing at each other, unsure of what was going to happen next. Some were surprised that Harrison would be so bold, while others wondered if the judge would let him get away with it. The thought of a powerful billionaire ignoring the rules of respect in front of a black judge was a bold challenge that was sure to catch the attention of everyone in the room. The judge made her way to the bench, her steps measured and deliberate. The sound of her heels against the floor echoed in the courtroom, each click adding to the mounting tension. As she reached the bench, she glanced briefly at Harrison. Still, there was no visible reaction from her. She took her seat, adjusted her robe, and called the court to order. There was no mention of Harrison's refusal to stand. No word spoken that acknowledged the disruption. But it was clear that this was just the beginning. Judge Owens knew the weight of the moment. She knew the power she held, not just as a judge, but as a person who had fought her entire life to get to this position. She wasn't going to let a man like Harrison Drake make a mockery of her courtroom. He may have thought his money and influence could make her back down, but he was about to learn that his arrogance would be his undoing. As the court session began, Harrison tried to go about the case as if nothing had happened. He focused on his papers, pretending to be unaffected. But there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Everyone in the room knew what had transpired. The energy had changed, and it wasn't in Harrison's favor. The respect that usually surrounded him seemed to slip away, replaced by a growing sense of anticipation. No one spoke it aloud, but the unspoken question lingered in the air. How would Judge Owens respond to this blatant disrespect? Would she tolerate it, or would she take a stand? The courtroom waited with bated breath, uncertain but certain that the judge's response was going to be a defining moment of this case. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence, with the only sound being the soft rustling of papers and the occasional shuffle of feet. Judge Malika Owens had not addressed Harrison Drake's refusal to stand, and for a moment it seemed as though nothing would happen. But to those who had been in her courtroom before, they knew better. This was her way of taking control. She wasn't reacting in the way people might expect, but rather, she was allowing the weight of the situation to build, letting the room feel the tension grow. Her calmness was deliberate, a sign that she wasn't rattled by his behavior. Harrison, on the other hand, seemed to think he had won some sort of victory. He continued to look down at his papers, pretending to focus on the case at hand, but his body language was stiff. He was waiting for the judge to acknowledge his disrespect, perhaps expecting her to react in a way that would allow him to further assert his power. But Judge Owens had a different plan. She had learned over the years that true authority didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed. And she wasn't about to let a billionaire with a bruised ego make her lose her focus. The case began, and the judge's voice rang out clearly, commanding the courtroom. She was concise, composed, and confident as she began to address the arguments presented by both sides. Harrison continued to act as if nothing had happened, his focus on the legal battle rather than the battle of wills that had just unfolded. But the longer he ignored what had occurred, the more the room seemed to shift. The tension remained thick in the air, with people glancing at Harrison, then at Judge Owens, wondering what she would do next. The other lawyers in the room knew better than to speak out. They had seen Judge Owens handle far worse situations with nothing but poise and professionalism. She was the kind of judge who didn't let personal issues or petty disrespect cloud her judgment. In fact, she was known for her fairness and impartiality. But there was a quiet strength in her presence now, something that set her apart from the typical authority figures that so often dominated courtrooms. She was more than just a judge. She was a symbol of resilience, especially in a system that had often tried to undermine her. As the trial continued, it became clear that Harrison was growing more uncomfortable. He had expected Judge Owens to lose her composure, to lash out, to react in a way that would give him an opening. But she wasn't playing by his rules. Instead, she was forcing him into a corner of his own making. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was power. She wasn't going to stoop to his level. The longer the trial went on, the more Harrison seemed to realize that this wasn't a case where he could simply bulldoze his way through with his wealth and influence. The courtroom, while still tense, began to feel like something else was brewing beneath the surface. It was as though everyone, even those who had initially been hesitant, was starting to see what was unfolding before them. The respect that had been given to Harrison because of his wealth and status was slowly being replaced by something else, a sense of awe and admiration for the judge's grace under pressure. Judge Owens didn't say a word about Harrison's earlier refusal to stand. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than any reprimand ever could. As the trial progressed, it became more evident that the true power in the room didn't come from money or influence. It came from her unshakable sense of self and her unwavering commitment to justice. Harrison had underestimated her. And now, as the case continued, it was becoming clear that he was no longer in control. As the trial continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier with each passing minute. Harrison Drake, though trying to maintain his usual air of confidence, couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling building inside him. He had expected the judge to give in, to allow his wealth and status to make a difference. But Judge Owens wasn't budging. Her calm, composed demeanor was like a steady force that seemed to push against his arrogance. He had tried to ignore her, to pretend as if her presence didn't matter, but now it was clear that she was in complete control of the situation. Harrison shifted in his seat, trying to focus on the case at hand, but his mind kept drifting back to the moment when he had refused to stand. The quiet defiance in his actions now felt like a mistake. He hadn't anticipated Judge Owens' calm strength. He had expected her to react with anger, or perhaps to show some sign of weakness. But instead, she had done the opposite. She had remained unshaken, and now the room was filled with an undeniable tension that seemed to be growing by the second. The people in the courtroom, the lawyers, the observers, everyone was watching to see how the situation would unfold. They could feel the shift. They were beginning to realize that Judge Owens wasn't just going to let Harrison's behavior slide. She wasn't the kind of judge who would allow someone to undermine the integrity of the court. They were all waiting for the moment when the judge would take action, and that moment seemed to be drawing closer. Then, without warning, Judge Owens called a brief recess. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. Harrison, now clearly uneasy, stood and walked out of the courtroom to stretch his legs. He tried to maintain his composure, but there was a visible tension in his steps. He had been used to walking into courtrooms and having people follow his every command. But today, something was different. Today, he had met his match. As Harrison stood outside the courtroom, he couldn't help but replay the scene in his head. He had thought that by sitting down, by refusing to stand for the judge, he could assert some kind of power over her. But now he was realizing how wrong he had been. There was no way to bend her to his will. He had underestimated her, and now he wasn't sure what to expect next. Inside the courtroom, Judge Owens sat at the bench, deep in thought. She had been through countless cases, but this one felt different. She had seen powerful figures try to use their influence to intimidate others, but she had always stood firm in her convictions. She wasn't going to let Harrison's wealth or arrogance affect the way she handled this case. She knew that she had to act, and she had already decided what her next move would be. When the recess ended, everyone returned to their seats, the courtroom quiet and tense. Harrison took his seat again, his posture slightly more rigid than before. He had expected some kind of confrontation, but the judge had yet to say anything about his earlier behavior. The suspense in the air was palpable. No one knew exactly what would happen, but they all knew that whatever was coming next, it would be significant. Judge Owens called the court back into session. She began to speak, and her voice carried with authority, yet with a calm that made everyone listen. She addressed the case at hand with the precision and focus she was known for. But as she spoke, her eyes flicked over to Harrison, and the room seemed to hold its breath. It was as if everyone in the room knew that the moment of reckoning was approaching. Harrison, still trying to maintain his cool, could feel his pulse quicken. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. As the court session continued, the tension in the room reached a boiling point. Everyone, from the lawyers to the onlookers, could feel the heavy weight of the situation. Harrison Drake, once so sure of his control over the courtroom, was now visibly uncomfortable. His usual confident demeanor had started to slip, and despite his best efforts to focus on the case, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had made a serious mistake. The more he tried to push the thoughts away, the more they crowded in. What had he done? Why hadn't he expected Judge Owens to be so unyielding? Judge Owens, meanwhile, was as composed as ever. She sat at the bench with the quiet authority that had earned her the respect of everyone who had ever stepped into her courtroom. She had handled high-profile cases, difficult individuals, and countless challenges throughout her career. But today, there was something different about the way she carried herself. It wasn't just her professionalism. It was her strength, her ability to command respect without even raising her voice. And it was this quality that made Harrison's earlier defiance feel like a foolish move. The judge continued to preside over the case with calm precision. She listened intently to the lawyers, asking questions when necessary, her voice steady and firm. It was clear that she wasn't letting the personal drama distract her from the legal proceedings. But behind the scenes, she was making a mental note. The way Harrison had refused to stand had been more than just an act of arrogance. It had been a challenge, one that she wasn't going to ignore. Without warning, the judge paused the proceedings. The room went silent, and all eyes turned to her. Harrison felt a slight tremor of anxiety run through him. He had been waiting for this moment, unsure of what it would bring. And now, it seemed like the time had come. Judge Owens set down her gavel and addressed the courtroom, her voice calm yet unyielding. "Mr. Drake," she began, her gaze sharp but controlled, "you are in contempt of this court." The words hit like a thunderclap. The room, which had been holding its breath, suddenly exhaled in collective shock. No one had expected the judge to act so swiftly, especially after her composed silence earlier. Harrison, though he tried to maintain his posture, felt the weight of her words sink in. He had underestimated her, thinking that his wealth and status would shield him from any consequences. But now, the reality was clear. Judge Owens was not the type of person to allow disrespect to go unpunished. For a moment, Harrison didn't know how to react. He had never been in a position like this before. He had always been the one in control, the one making the rules, and here he was, being publicly reprimanded by a judge in front of the entire courtroom. His usual confidence seemed to evaporate in the face of her calm authority. The shockwaves of the judge's decision rippled through the room. Some of the onlookers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Others sat with bated breath, watching as the powerful billionaire, once so untouchable, was now forced to face the consequences of his actions. His legal team, though trying to salvage the situation, were clearly rattled. They had never expected this turn of events. It was one thing to argue in a courtroom, but it was another thing entirely to try and argue with a judge who had made her decision. Harrison could feel the weight of the eyes upon him, but it wasn't just the people in the courtroom who were watching. News cameras had been rolling, capturing the moment for the outside world. The media would undoubtedly latch onto this story, and his reputation, already carefully cultivated, would be forever tarnished. And yet, despite the shock and disbelief running through him, Harrison knew that there was nothing he could do to change what had just happened. The judge's decision had been made, and in that moment, he was reminded of something he had forgotten. Money and power didn't always win. Respect, integrity, and authority were things that could not be bought. And today, it was Judge Owens who had shown him just how powerful those qualities could be. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the full weight of the judge's decision settled over everyone present. Harrison Drake's face flushed a deep shade of red. He had never been publicly humiliated in this way, especially not in a place where he had spent so much of his life getting his way. He was used to being the one calling the shots, whether in business or in the courtrooms, but now he found himself at the mercy of someone he had underestimated. His legal team rushed to his side, trying to salvage the situation. They were quick to protest, but their arguments fell flat against the calm resolve of Judge Owens. They knew they couldn't change her decision. She had made it clear with her firm, no-nonsense tone that she would not back down. Harrison's usual confidence had all but evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of panic that gnawed at him. For the first time in a long while, he realized that he couldn't simply buy his way out of a problem. Harrison took a moment to collect himself. He adjusted his tie, straightened his suit, and looked toward Judge Owens, trying to regain his composure. His eyes, once filled with the arrogance that came with wealth and power, were now searching for any way to undo the damage he had caused. But it was too late for that. The damage had already been done, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. The room fell silent as everyone waited to see how he would respond. Would he apologize, or would he continue to fight back? The judge sat in her chair, watching him with calm, steady eyes. There was no anger in her gaze, only a quiet strength that commanded respect. She had been in difficult situations before, and she knew that this was just another test of her character. She wasn't about to let someone like Harrison Drake derail the principles she had worked so hard to uphold. She had earned her position through hard work and dedication, not by bending to the will of the powerful. Harrison took a deep breath, his mind racing. He realized that he had misjudged Judge Owens in more ways than one. He had assumed that, like so many others in his world, she could be intimidated by his wealth, his influence, or his ability to sway people with his charm. But he had learned the hard way that some people couldn't be bought or bullied. Some people stood for something bigger than themselves. And Judge Owens was one of those people. After a long pause, Harrison finally spoke, his voice less confident than usual. "I apologize for my actions, Your Honor," he said, though the words felt foreign to him. The apology came out almost reluctantly, as if it was a concession he hadn't planned on making. But the reality of the situation was clear now. There was no way around it. He had to acknowledge his mistake, no matter how hard it was for him to admit. Judge Owens didn't immediately respond. She let his words hang in the air, and for a moment, Harrison wondered if he had said enough. But the judge's eyes never wavered. She was watching him closely, studying his every move, as if trying to determine whether his apology was genuine or simply a strategic attempt to escape the consequences. The courtroom waited in silence, the tension still thick in the air. Harrison's legal team was visibly uncomfortable, unsure of what to do next. They had tried to fight back, but they knew better than to challenge the judge. Harrison's apology had been his only choice, and now the question was whether it would be enough to sway her decision. Judge Owens finally spoke, her voice calm and authoritative. "Your apology is noted, Mr. Drake. But it doesn't change the fact that you disrespected this court. Respect is the foundation of any legal system, and I will not tolerate any behavior that undermines it. You may be powerful in other areas of your life, but in this courtroom, we are all equal." Harrison's shoulders slumped, and he could feel the eyes of the room on him. The humiliation was evident now, and no amount of wealth or status could take it away. His reputation had taken a hit, and the lessons learned today were not ones that money could erase. He had expected to walk in and dominate, but instead, he had found himself humbled. As the judge's words settled over Harrison Drake, he couldn't help but feel the full weight of the situation. His apology had been made, but it hadn't done enough to erase the humiliation of what had just happened. The courtroom, which had once felt like a place where he could command the room, now felt foreign to him. The respect he had so casually expected from everyone had disappeared, replaced by something much more important: integrity. Judge Owens had proven that respect could not be bought or demanded, and that realization stung harder than he had anticipated. Outside the courtroom, the news had already started to spread. The story of the arrogant billionaire and the unshakable judge was making headlines. It wasn't just a typical legal drama. It was a story about power, respect, and the consequences of arrogance. People were talking about it everywhere. Social media buzzed with comments about Judge Owens' decision, praising her strength and fairness. News outlets praised her as a symbol of justice, and in a way, She had become a hero to those who had long felt overlooked by the powerful. Her actions had spoken louder than words, and now the entire country seemed to be taking notice. Meanwhile, Harrison was grappling with the aftermath. He had never been one to admit defeat, but this was different. His usual ways of getting out of tight situations weren't working. For the first time in his life, he found himself questioning the way he had approached the world. His wealth, his influence, they had always been his safety net, his shield. But here, in this courtroom, those things meant nothing. He was just another person subject to the law, and his behavior had crossed a line. The public's reaction to his actions was not something he had expected, and it made him feel as though the walls he had spent his life building had come crashing down. As the case continued, Harrison tried to regain his focus, but it was hard. His mind kept drifting back to the moment when he had refused to stand for Judge Owens. He had been too arrogant, too sure of himself. He had thought his status would protect him from any consequences, but it hadn't. And now, the damage had been done. The judge's response, her quiet authority, had sent a message that was impossible to ignore. His behavior had been a challenge to her, but she had responded with dignity and poise. In doing so, she had made it clear that no one was above the law. The lawyers on his team kept glancing at him, unsure of how to proceed. They had never seen their client this rattled before. They had always relied on his power to intimidate opponents and influence outcomes, but now they realized that they were working with a man who had just learned a hard lesson. Harrison had always been in control of his surroundings, but in this courtroom, Judge Owens had shown him that true power came from respect, not dominance. By the end of the day, the media had made their verdict clear. Judge Owens had come out as the hero of the story. She had proven that no one, no matter how powerful or wealthy, could escape the consequences of their actions if they disrespected the court. Harrison's apology, though necessary, did little to undo the damage to his reputation. The story of the arrogant billionaire and the strong judge would be remembered for a long time. People admired the judge not only for her legal expertise, but for her unshakable belief in fairness, and that belief was something that resonated deeply with the public. As Harrison left the courtroom, the gravity of the day's events began to sink in. The world had seen his arrogance exposed for what it was, and he couldn't take that back. He had tried to manipulate the situation, but Judge Owens had shown him that no one could control justice. The lessons learned today would be ones he would carry with him for a long time. He had been humbled, not by the law, but by the power of integrity. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to truly respect someone. The days that followed were filled with the kind of media frenzy that Harrison Drake was no stranger to. But this time, it wasn't the kind of attention he usually welcomed. Headlines across newspapers, news outlets, and social media platforms were focused on one thing: the billionaire who had disrespected a judge in his arrogance, only to face the consequences of his actions. For someone who had spent most of his life being adored by the media and feared by his competitors, this kind of exposure was a shock to the system. The public reaction was swift and overwhelming. People had long grown tired of the rich and powerful thinking they were untouchable, and Harrison's behavior in court became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. Many rallied behind Judge Malika Owens, admiring her for standing her ground and showing that no one, no matter their status, could escape the rule of law. Her actions became a source of inspiration for countless individuals who had long felt overlooked or disregarded in the face of wealth and power. They saw in her not just a judge, but a defender of fairness, someone who upheld justice when it mattered most. As for Harrison, the reality of his mistake began to sink in. He could no longer hide behind his wealth, his status, or his corporate empire. His once unshakable confidence had been shattered, and for the first time, he realized just how vulnerable he was. His lawyers worked tirelessly to limit the fallout, but there was no escaping the damage to his public image. The more they tried to spin the narrative, the more it became clear that the story of the arrogant billionaire had taken on a life of its own. The media did not let up. Everywhere Harrison went, reporters hounded him. asking questions about his behavior in court and about the apology he had reluctantly offered. People criticized him for not understanding the significance of what he had done, for not realizing that the legal system was built on respect and equality, not on power and influence. It wasn't just the press that was unforgiving. The public also voiced their discontent, with many calling for him to do more than simply apologize. They wanted him to take responsibility for his actions in a meaningful way. Over time, Harrison began to reflect on what had happened. He thought back to the moment when he had refused to stand for Judge Owens, and the realization hit him hard. He had believed that his wealth, his power, and his influence could protect him from the consequences of his actions. But that had been his mistake. He had misjudged Judge Owens, thinking that her authority could be easily ignored. And more importantly, he had underestimated the strength of the people who supported her, people who saw her not just as a judge, but as a beacon of justice in a world that often felt unfair. In the months that followed, Harrison took steps to make amends, though it wasn't easy. His first act was to publicly donate a significant portion of his fortune to organizations that promoted legal reform and social justice. He also began speaking out about the importance of respecting the law, acknowledging that his previous behavior had been harmful, not just to Judge Owens, but to the system as a whole. His words were met with skepticism by some, who believed that his apology was too little, too late. But over time, he continued to speak up and make efforts to show that he had learned from his mistakes. Meanwhile, Judge Owens' career only continued to flourish. The case, while relatively small in legal terms, had catapulted her into the national spotlight. People admired her for standing firm in the face of disrespect, and her reputation as a strong, fair, and principled judge only grew. She was invited to speak at conferences, and her story was shared as an example of the kind of leadership that the world needed. By the time the dust had settled, both Harrison and Judge Owens had become symbols of different aspects of power. For Harrison, his journey had been one of humbling realization. He had learned that true power did not come from money, influence, or status. It came from respect, humility, and a willingness to uphold what was right. For Judge Owens, her moment of quiet authority in the courtroom had cemented her place as a role model for those who believed in fairness and justice. Harrison's story became a lesson in humility, while Judge Owens continued to inspire others to stand firm in the face of adversity. And for everyone who witnessed the events unfold, it was a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, is beyond the reach of justice.